Hello, my name is Liz Naj. I'm a senior at Smith College and a double major in East Asian Literatures and Languages and Environmental Policy. Today I'm going to talk to you about my experience with Japanese in Japan and some meaningful conversations I was able to have with my host mother in the country about gender and minorities. And so I was able to study abroad in Kyoto, Japan in fall of 2016. And when I wasn't at school or exploring the city, I came home to a lovely couple in their 60s who was my host family for 4.5 months. And I immediately hit it off with my host family, specifically my host mother. She was a very quirky, loving woman who was very outspoken, very opinionated, very forward-thinking and open-minded, and we would have conversations about everything from the environment to politics to pop culture to, wow, look at that fashion today. Great skirts, right? And she just talked about everything, and it gave me such a good perspective on the culture of Japan from daily life to deeper things. And one of the deeper things was gender. And so in Japan, gender inequality is ranked at 114 on the national scale. It's not the best country for women socially and in the workplace. And my host mom defied all expectations I had of a woman in the social and the workplace sphere. And by that, I mean that she was a woman who had worked all her life, which was uncommon, especially since she'd had a child. And a lot of women in Japan who do work don't return to the workplace after having a child. She still worked. She's still working now in a part-time job as an accountant while her husband is retired, which is interesting, and she completely runs the household. She travels where she wants to. She tells host dad what to do all the time. He's off running her errands. It's fantastic. Completely unexpected from my cultural and literary studies of Japan. And so I asked her one day, maybe a month in, how do you do it? How has it been for you as a woman in Japan who's really just lived her life without limitations from what I've seen? She's so accomplished in so many fields, the workplace, the family life, social sphere, everything. And she said, I have things I want to do in my life, and I just do them. And I said, can you elaborate a little? There's a lot of social and gender and familial expectations on women in Japan. Was it difficult or easy for you? How has your life been shaped by the social atmosphere and your own personal desires as you grew up to want to work and travel? And she told me that it was definitely not the easiest thing. She faced a lot of isolation from her peers, like women who didn't want to work after college, women who thought she was being selfish when she returned to the workforce after having a child. Especially her mother-in-law, as most people seem to not get along with their mother-in-laws. Hers did not like her from the start, and she really did not like her for leaving the home sphere after having her son to return to work. And despite all that, she really boiled it down to the fact that she is a strong, independent person who had things she wanted to do with her life, travel, work, etc. And she just went for it. And it was hard, but she made it happen. And that was really inspiring and empowering. And if the situation today in Japan is really difficult, I can't imagine what it was like for her as a woman who grew up in the 1960s with a much heavier social atmosphere surrounding a woman in the workplace and pursuing individual desires. So it made me much more hopeful and inspired for women's abilities and potential today. And so that was a really hopeful conversation that we had. The second one was a little different, and this was about minorities in Japan. And so when I was in Japan, I was taking a class on minorities, and that week we'd been learning about Zainichi Korean, who are people of Korean descent who live in Japan, and a lot of those people would identify Japan as their homeland or really connecting with the culture there. Some people haven't even been to Korea or speak the language. Like, they're really invested in Japan in a social and economic and all of those different senses. And so I told her what I was learning about, and she kind of closed off and asked, why would you want to learn about that? What are you talking about that for? That's really othering, giving people all of these labels. And I kind of had to take a step back and, tell her, oh, well, I'm really interested in the history and ideology and the culture kind of surrounding these people's identities and how they're perceived today. And she really saw it as a barrier between people, whereas I saw it as a way to understand the baggage and burdens that come with different identities and how people are perceived. And eventually, I was able to drag out of her an anecdote about her childhood friend who was a Zainichi Korean. And this girl who was Zainichi Korean was bullied and discriminated against in grade school. But she was my host mom's best friend. And when I asked her how she responded to that, attitude, she told me that she didn't see her friend as Zainichi Korean. She was just a person, she was just her friend, a schoolgirl who was basically Japanese. And for my host mom, this was really a way of accepting her friend and trying to break down barriers between people. But for me, in my American context, I kind of placed it more in the colorblind argument, where you put aside all of the stereotypes and baggage and burden that come with different identities if you're a marginalized person. And it was really a new way for me to try and think about how people engage with otherness in different countries. And like I said, my host mom was a really open-minded person. She was willing to talk to me about this. She was always willing to have hard conversations. And so it made me think about the different ways that discourses around identity and gender and minorities are shaped, and it made me so much more interested in how the Japanese discourse around minorities and other communities was founded, the history, the culture, the ideology behind it. And so in my studies in Japan, and since coming back, I've really tried harder to look at a lot of the Japanese literature surrounding, the formation of these discourses and ideologies. And I am so grateful to my host mom for having these conversations, because it gave me such an inside perspective and such a drive to try and better understand where her perspective is coming from in trying to bring people together versus my American perspective and how that differs, and trying to look at, like I said, the history behind Japan's view of otherness, and also the way that Japan might be in conversation with the US or other countries to try and further the discussion on these issues. And so I hope that in the future I can use my Japanese language and definitely these foundational experiences to better study and converse with people in Japan about their perspective on these issues, and hopefully give some of my perspective and try and really create a cross-cultural exchange and progression of the debate on minority and gender discourse in Japan. So, thank you.